You know you can stay in stunning homes across Mount Hood, the coast, Central Oregon, all of our state's beautiful landscapes, and save over 5 to 15% by just going through a local business? Cascadia Getaways is Oregon-owned and operated by locals who love this state as much as you do. Visit CascadiaGetaways.com to book your next trip or partner with their team. That's CascadiaGetaways.com.
You can make a difference in someone's life, including your own, with a job in home care. These jobs offer flexible schedules, healthcare, retirement options, and free training. They also provide paid time off and opportunities for overtime. Visit OregonHomeCareJobs.com to learn more and apply. That's OregonHomeCareJobs.com.
A new report shows that the Portland area spent more than $700 million on homeless services last year. But despite the urgency of the issue and the increased investment, one estimate says deaths among Portlanders experiencing homelessness quadrupled between 2019 and 2023. Today on CityCast Portland, our host Claudia Meza is talking with Street Roots editor-in-chief Kay Rambo. They recently reported on the spike in deaths in a collaboration with ProPublica. It's Tuesday, July 22nd. I'm executive producer John Notarianni, and this is what Portland's talking about.
So you recently reported that despite all of the investment in tackling homelessness in our region, deaths among homeless Portlanders quadrupled in recent years. And Multnomah County now has the highest homeless death rate on the West Coast, which is crazy to think, the entire West Coast. Before we dive into potential reasons, can you just help us put that number into context? Because, how exactly are we stacking up against other West Coast cities? Is it by a point? How vast is that breadth?
Yeah, so for cities that have at least 500,000 people, and the data has to be broken down generally by county because that is the way that governments record it. Portland has, like you pointed out, the highest homeless mortality rate on the West Coast for cities and counties with available data. It is not a small difference either. Other than San Diego, Portland has at least double the homeless mortality rate of any of these other jurisdictions. And that was not the case just a few years ago. Like you pointed out, the overall number of recorded deaths have more than quadrupled since 2019. And the last couple of years include a new data source from the state. But even without that, the homeless deaths have increased by more than tripled by any metric.
It's kind of interesting that San Diego was close second because to me, they're so temperate. And not only that, I don't know if you've ever been to San Diego, Kay, but it's kind of hoity-toity. You would think they'd have the money.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, and it was one of, I think, kind of the earlier clues as I was trying to figure out, what was going on with Portland, why homeless deaths were increasing so quickly, why the mortality rate was increasing so quickly. And then I think a lot of the explanations would be something like, well, we have more extreme weather recently, or, we have a particular problem with fentanyl here or something to that extent. But then you look at San Diego, which has, as you pointed out, a really nice climate, and they still have this really high mortality rate. Similarly to Portland, San Diego conducts a lot of sweeps of homeless encampments. Looking at the data that's available for sweeps, San Diego is the only city that comes close to Portland in terms of volume, both overall and per capita. And they are also the two cities that have, by a very wide margin, the largest homeless mortality rate of any West Coast city with available data.
Interesting. So when did you see the trend of Portland's homeless population, the deaths among them? When did you see that trend? Was it something that you discovered, or was it something that was already out there in research?
So the county publishes an annual report of homeless deaths. It's called Domicile Unknown. And at Street Roots, we cover it every year when it comes out. And beginning between 2020 and 2021, we really started to see a very sharp increase in deaths. I think the assumption at the time for a lot of people was, well, you've got fentanyl, you've got COVID. There are, I think, a lot of other factors that folks could look at and assume that that's the explanation for why the deaths are going up. That trend continued, and it actually really accelerated to the point where, we've now had 2 consecutive years of deaths nearly doubling, which is how you're kind of seeing this exponential increase. So it's something that we've been paying attention to at Street Roots just, in the course of our reporting, and partnering with ProPublica to work on this story kind of gave us the opportunity to dig into a topic that we've been watching for years and just haven't had the time and resources to really investigate as thoroughly as I think it needs to be.
Well, as you were stating, we've seen a number of increasing factors, like you were talking about, fentanyl overdoses, also just the pandemic. And you're basically saying this isn't explaining the spike. So why is that? And what is the cause then?
Yeah, I mean, and that's kind of the core question of the whole thing, right? And what researchers and doctors explain to me is that, if you look at Los Angeles or Seattle or Sacramento, these are places that also have issues with fentanyl. COVID also disrupted services in those places, but you don't see the same mortality rate, right? And if the problem that is happening in Portland were able to be attributed to COVID and fentanyl alone, you would have seen a similar thing in other places. And you just haven't, right? There have been small increases that have started to level off in a lot of places, but it's the cities like Portland and San Diego where you are seeing a really extreme acceleration in the number of sweeps and how frequently people are being swept that you're seeing this mortality rate increase so sharply. And, to that end, I mean, Portland now sweeps 3 times as many camps, more than that actually, per year than it did in 2019. Certainly, I'm sure, part of that has to do with just the fact that homelessness has increased a lot since 2019. But it is a lot more sweeps per person than have happened in the past. And all of the research, all of the experts, the physicians I interviewed were unequivocal in, saying that this type of displacement and destabilization does nothing but harm people's health. So the way it was put to me by the end of it was, if it's not sweeps, I mean, the real question is, what else could it possibly be? And so, I went through all of those possibilities, and all of the data, all of the expert opinions point to sweeps being the thing that's exacerbating existing issues or things like fentanyl, right? There are studies that show sweeps increase the risk of overdose from fentanyl or from opioids. So it's something that there's just nothing else to really explain why San Diego and Portland would have such a particular issue.
So you're saying basically the correlation that was found between those 2 cities, Portland and San Diego, was that they both just conducted more sweeps.
That's right. And there's a considerable amount of research, not just, correlation, but causal research around the impacts of sweeps.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the data that supports that it's sweeps, because I understand it wasn't just like, oh, it's kind of inconvenient that they have to start all over. It's like they're getting separated from medication. They're getting separated from life-saving resources. So I'm curious about all the ways that sweeps increase the mortality rate, but specifically how are overdoses being exacerbated with sweeps?
Yeah, I mean, the ways that these sweeps really impact people come down to, like I was talking about, destabilization. There's a certain amount of alienation because people are, never really allowed to be in public. But, a sweep, essentially what happens is independent for-profit contractors that the city pays for with public money go and post an encampment, giving them a time frame for which that sweep is going to happen. Oftentimes those are postponed, which Street Roots has covered that in the past. But when they actually come to sweep the encampments, generally speaking, there's not an offer of shelter. There's not an offer of resources. These are not social workers who are going out and sweeping these camps. They're folks who go out and essentially their job is to make sure that by the time they leave, there's no more people there and there are no more belongings there. So in that process, people lose medication, they lose their IDs, they lose, things like naloxone, really, really vital, critical things that people need. And so, when that's happening 7,000 times a year, that is a lot of risk introduction. For folks who are dealing with addiction, if you are losing your addiction medication, if you are losing your naloxone, if you are losing your ID, if you are losing your phone, if you then return to the place where you previously had a support system who could respond in the event of an overdose, it completely disrupts the process that people have to go through to be able to receive addiction treatment. And it also very much disrupts any, kind of reasonable possibility that somebody could overdose and somebody could help them and save their life, right? It decreases the opportunities for somebody to help somebody. When you kind of put all those things together, these are really, life-changing events for people. And many people are being swept 3, 4, 5 times a year and having to start over that many times a year. And, for some folks, that is a life or death proposition.
Paint Care has 3 simple rules to help you paint smarter. 1, buy only what you need. Determining the right amount of paint for your next project can be tricky, but tips like measuring your space and asking your local paint store for advice will help ensure you have enough for your project while minimizing waste. 2, use up what you have. Look around your house and find simple DIY projects where you can use up your paint. Or you could give away your leftover paint to friends, neighbors, or community groups who could benefit from it. 3, recycle the rest at convenient locations like your neighborhood paint store. Paint Care even offers direct pickups for households and businesses with more than 100 gallons of leftover paint. Learn more or find a paint drop-off site near you at paintcare.org/3simplerules. I am so excited to tell you about the North Coast Express. That's the new seasonal transit option connecting Portland to the most iconic destinations on the Oregon North Coast. On top of just getting to sit back and relax since you're not driving, all buses include free Wi-Fi and charging ports, onboard restrooms, panoramic windows and reclining seats, wheelchair-accessible lifts, and you can grab the bus from Portland Fridays through Sunday through the end of August. There's flexible return day ticketing, which lets you choose between a spontaneous day trip or a longer coastal stay. For more information like tickets, schedules, and the full route, go to visittheoregoncoast.com/express. That's visittheoregoncoast.com/express. What we hear from officials is that the sweeps are necessary. This is what we're hearing. And I'm sure you've heard this too, because it's like to sweep or not to sweep. If you don't sweep, sometimes you're allowing some of these communities that could actually cause more harm than good to the people who live there. Like what you hear is like, oh, people are using them, not everyone, of course, but just like bad actors are using them as a cover for, like you said, selling drugs or other nefarious actions. But what I'm seeing is like basically like everything looks like something to hit with a hammer, and that's always a sweep. You know what they're saying? Like if like your only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, you're just gonna hit everything. Mm-hmm. And like this is what it seems like. It's like all that we have are sweeps. So are there an alternative to sweeps that would at all address some concerns that the city and the county have also discussed about these larger camps? The spread of diseases, the hiding of illegal actions, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I feel like as a journalist, right, and looking at these things from really like an objective, what can I prove? What is the truth that I can find in all this? There are many more hypothetical situations of why sweeps would benefit anybody than there are real ones, right? And I think there are a lot more very real, provable examples of sweeps disrupting people's lives in a way that harms everybody than there are kind of real examples of where sweeps are beneficial. So I think the most correct answer as far as what an alternative would be, it would be taking this money and putting it into things that reduce homelessness, like housing, right? Sweeps don't reduce homelessness. The tie between congregate shelters and homelessness reduction really isn't there, but the city has not really sought out evidence, let alone pursued an evidence-based strategy. I think obviously getting people into housing and getting them healthcare and things like that is a longer term project that I think the city, verbally is interested in, but not so much in terms of its actions. In the meantime, I think, if that is everybody's goal, is to actually end homelessness, the question I asked researchers was, is there an example of when a sweep is truly beneficial? Unequivocally, the answer to that was no. Now, are there times when theoretically, hypothetically, could there be things in a particular encampment that pose a risk to the people in them or the people around those encampments? Of course. What I heard from, researchers and physicians was, there are limited examples of when people might need to leave so there can be some cleaning done or something, but that type of action can be organized in a way that is very different from a sweep. That is not this level of destabilization and kind of further dismantling people's lives. It can be done in a way that is collaborative or truly focused on the health of the people in that encampment. And I think that's something that, gets lost in all of this a lot of the times. And I think that there are a lot of actions like sweeps that get attributed to a desire for improved health that the city has not done any research to be able to back that claim up, right? So I think that's really, is there a little something to that? Yes, but it is so limited, and the action that could be taken that genuinely would help people's health is so different from what the city is actually doing in those situations.
Yeah. So under Mayor Keith Wilson, the city has been doubling down on expanding the number of shelters, congregate shelters. Are you seeing evidence that they're helping to mitigate this issue? I'm curious because when I speak to people who are on the ground, like Blanchet House, we had the executive director on a handful of months ago. He seemed hopeful with how things were turning out. And so I'm curious, what you're seeing.
Yeah, Scott Kerman from Blanchet House is one of the folks I interviewed early on in the process of working on this article. And I think there was a lot of optimism 6.5 months ago, 7 months ago. I haven't spoken to Scott about Mayor Wilson's plan since that point.
Same.
So
yeah.
I can't speak to that. But I do know that, the folks that I'm still talking to and hearing from in response to this story, different service providers, is that they're not really seeing a huge benefit. And so I think what folks fail to understand about congregate shelter is that there are limited situations in which, if we're especially talking about this large number, like this idea of everybody's going to go into a temporary shelter, it's a very select percentage of people that experience is going to provide more safety, put them into housing, get them healthcare, whatever the case may be. Of course, there are those instances, there are those examples, and, I'm not trying to discount that. At a much larger level, though, if we're talking about an issue, which it is systemic, right? And I think that that's something that gets lost, is people attribute individual circumstances to homelessness much more than they talk about rent going up 40% in Portland over the last 5 years, or, wages not going up 41%, right? So, you have a lot of things in place that fail to account for how do you get somebody from the streets into housing, right? Congregate shelters are not, generally speaking, that thing. There's not a lot of evidence to suggest that sticking somebody in a big warehouse overnight with 100 other people, that they wake up the next morning and are any closer to housing and stability than they were 2 nights ago when they slept in a park with 100 other people. And if we're talking specifically about mortality, you can look at a place like New York City that has a right to shelter law and has a ton of shelter, and compare that to a place like Seattle, which doesn't have a right to shelter law, doesn't have a ton of shelter. Their mortality rates are similar. And this is something that the researchers who had studied homeless mortality over the course of a decade plus, they were really seemed to be very surprised that in their research, they found there's not a very strong correlation between the availability of emergency shelter and reduced mortality rates.
This episode of CityCast is sponsored by Babbel. Learning a new language opens the door to new friends, new cultures, maybe even a whole new life. So why not start that journey today? You can start speaking a new language with confidence thanks to Babbel's conversation-based technique that quickly teaches you useful words and phrases about the things you actually talk about in the real world. I'm CityCast CEO David Plotz, and I've been learning Spanish with Babbel, just one of the 12 languages you can learn with it, including Dutch, French, Italian, which is going to be next for me, Turkish, and Russian. I love the interactive dialogues that Babbel has, which allow me to practice what I've learned right away, and also the speech recognition function, which makes sure I'm getting the pronunciation just right, which honestly, usually I'm not. Also, I love that Babbel's lessons always cover actual things that I talk about in the real world, like food, talking to people I've just met, and also food. Staying motivated to learn a new language has never been easier thanks to real-time feedback, progress trackers, and handy visualizations in only 10 to 15 minutes a day on Babbel's mobile app or website. So get talking with Babbel. I want you to learn another language, so I'm teaming up with Babbel to gift you 55% off subscriptions, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/citycast. Get up to 55% off at babbel.com/citycast. Spelled BABBEL.com/citycast. Babbel.com/citycast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
This podcast is supported by Progressive, a leader in RV insurance. RVs are for sharing adventures with family, friends, and even your pets. So if you bring your cats and dogs along for the ride, you'll want Progressive RV insurance. They protect your cats and dogs like family by offering up to $1,000 in optional coverage for vet bills in case of an RV accident, making it a great companion for the responsible pet owner who loves to travel. See Progressive's other benefits and more when you quote RV insurance at Progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Pet injuries and additional coverage and subject to policy terms.
So when we discuss Keith Wilson's unsheltered goal, he's going to end unsheltered homelessness by the end of this year. That is his goal. When we discuss that with him, he's always really adamant that he's like, I'm not trying to end homelessness. I'm trying to end unsheltered homelessness. And I get that there are other things that need to happen, but this is the first step and we need to take a first step. So what's the issue with that? If they're just like, we don't have the funds to do the thing that maybe everybody else is saying should be done because it's not practical, because whatever they're saying, and this is the quickest way to get people off of the streets to what they're considering life-saving services, to all these things. Like, why are we talking in circles about this?
Well, I mean, in a lot of ways, I think it's because the public, our readers, right, the folks that I hear from, I mean, really, there's kind of two main buckets of concern that I hear about, right? One is this more aesthetic kind of my feelings of safety. I feel unsafe around homeless people. My customers feel unsafe when they see homeless people out front. And then there's kind of the other bucket, which is I would like for people to have a place to live and healthcare and the ability to have a lasting way to address their situation, right? Because that's the thing that I think addresses kind of everybody's concern, right? If people have housing, they're no longer homeless, right? So then you have this other side of it. If people have housing, they're no longer exposed to the dangers of the streets or feeling excluded or unsafe at shelters, right? So I think the reality is the data suggests that putting people into these mass shelters, or really any form of shelter that does not have an explicit way to get housing, doesn't really end homelessness. Now, if the goal is not to end it, I mean, you can spend a bunch of money and push people out of public view and probably make a lot of people very, very happy if you're a politician, right? The reality is that creates a place where resources go that is not solutions oriented. It's similar to sweeps, right? Like sweeps are focused on largely an aesthetic concern. So if you're investing, I mean, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars in sweeps and temporary shelter, and neither of those things have this direct tie to push people into housing, I think then the conversation is about like, is this an effective and efficient use of our resources?
Yeah. You're saying it's more like optics.
I mean, at a very like literal sense, yeah. I think that there are a lot of things, and I'm not saying that people in the city aren't compassionate and concerned and genuinely do care. I'm not saying that this is something malicious. I'm saying that I think this is an approach that has gained a lot of purchase without having, I think, the data and research behind it to really justify such an amount of purchase. And if we're talking about the city of Portland, it is also a deprioritization of really the one thing that, if you listen to researchers, if you look at the data, the first step to getting people help with addiction, to getting people help with chronic health conditions, to getting people, the opportunity to go to school, get a job. Housing is the first and most effective step in that. So I think it begins to be a conversation of long-term effectiveness and efficiency.
So a lot of the data from your reporting is from like this 4-year period from 2019 to 2023. And clearly there's been a lot of attention on this issue in the past 12 months. Are we seeing any indication that the situation is improving?
I mean, it's really hard to say. Part of the issue is that mortality data is always a full year behind. So, we won't know how many people died in 2024 until December of 2025, right? So I don't know with certainty where things are going. I mean, anecdotally, I'm hearing that things are worse than they've ever been from people on the streets, but I can't say statistically what's happening until the county releases the next round of data.
Have you seen any response from the city based on your reporting?
There's been a little. I think that there are some city commissioners who are starting to feel a little skeptical and have expressed a bit of skepticism around the amount of money that is going to Portland Solutions, which encompasses environmental management, which does sweeps, and impact reduction program, which does sweeps. I think, if anything, what I'm sensing from officials is that a lot of people they don't actually understand how these sweeps work. They don't know what they look like. And I think that the city has really kind of put out this message that we have social workers, we have outreach teams who go out and they talk to people and they offer them services. And I think it's starting to become more clear to people in government who believe that people are not really getting connected with services. These sweeps are not the last resort, which I think is kind of how the city tries to play it. And I think that as there are new city commissioners coming in and starting to see the city spends a ton of money on these programs, it's a lot of money going to something that I think people are increasingly skeptical of if there are benefits, especially as the very real, objective, proven harms are starting to become more and more apparent to people, both here and elsewhere from research.
Right. Well, thank you for hanging out. I appreciate you taking the time to speaking with us.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, that's all for today here on CityCast Portland. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more from around the city. Until then, see you at Slim's.